We're joined now live from Canberra by the newly elected member for the seat of Melbourne, the Greens, Bandt, and from Adelaide by a man who shares the balance of power and the current Senate Independent Senator Nick Xenophon. Thanks to both of you for being there. And Nick Xenophon, I'll start with you and I'll get your reaction to what you just heard Bob Katter say in reaction to Tony Abbott's continuing refusal to submit the Coalition's policies to Treasury for costing.
Well, it is a blunder. I agree with Bob, and I presume that Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor share the same view. I think there's a bit of irony here. It was the Coalition that suggested a parliamentary budget office during the election campaign based on the US's Congressional Budget Office, which is the best way forward to give impartial, fearless advice to all sides of politics in terms of costings. I think that Tony Abbott's dilemma is this: if the independents trust the public service, then he needs to trust the independents on that. I don't think he's really got any choice otherwise. I think that will really put Tony Abbott in a very difficult position in any further negotiations with them.
So your prediction is he'll have to backflip on this decision, otherwise he runs the risk of actually losing any chance of getting their support.
Look, as an act of goodwill, and I think that Bob Katter put caveats on it. I don't necessarily agree with them, but Bob Katter put his caveats on it, that he's not necessarily going to accept everything that Treasury says, but it's important that Treasury has a chance to look at the opposition's costings. I think that's the only way forward. Tony, the situation right now is incredibly fluid. There are so many permutations that are in the mix, and this would clearly be a negative for the Coalition unless they move forward when it comes to providing their costings to Treasury.
What about the other suggestion by Bob Katter? This may not necessarily be a blunder, but in fact an attempt by Tony Abbott to force an election. Another election, a fresh election.
I think it's a bit of a high-risk strategy. I really hope that a stable government can be formed sooner rather than later, and once it is, if there can be a breakthrough in terms of electoral reforms, parliamentary reforms, so that we get a taste, Australians get a taste for what real democracy in terms of a less partisan, a more open democracy is like, then I think there's a real chance it could be entrenched in our political culture.
Bandt, you've obviously met and now talked to these three independents. I mean, we've caught the reaction of Bob Katter on first hearing Tony Abbott's decision not to submit his costings to the Treasury. That was a position, obviously, before the election, and he didn't trust Treasury because of the leaks. How do you suspect they will react as a group, and how negative will it be?
Oh, look, I think that's up to them. I've only met them over the last few days. A few unexpected things have happened over that time, including that I'm finding myself agreeing with Bob Katter on some important things, and I think those costings should have been submitted. And I pause to note the irony that prior to the election, the Greens, we sought to submit our costings to our proposals to Treasury for costings and were knocked back, made them available nonetheless. And I think it's incumbent on someone who wants to lead the country that they should submit them to Treasury for costing.
So you heard Bob Katter also suggesting, I just ran this past Nick Xenophon, that perhaps Tony Abbott was trying to force a fresh election. Do you think that's a possibility, and could it actually happen if the independents are completely alienated from the negotiating process? Well,
I think that's a matter for the independents, how they want to react to it, but I don't think that there's an appetite for going to another election for the sake of it. The approach that I'm taking to the discussions at the moment is that we need to get stable, effective and progressive government that will last a full term and that will be able to deliver.
The key thing from your point of view there is progressive government, and you said today you'd be prepared to go into some kind of formal alliance with the Labor Party. What do you mean by that exactly?
Oh, look, I don't think that should be taken out of context. The point that I was making was that in the discussions that we're having at the moment, and that will be reconvening again before the end of the week, the aim is to reach an agreement that will last and an agreement that will be stable and deliver that effective and progressive government. And the point that I was making is that nothing's on or off the table, and that I'm not going to go into in public what may or may not be being discussed. But the point is that the end outcome is something that will hopefully result in a parliament that will last the full term.
But one of the possibilities, obviously, is for the Greens to enter some sort of formal arrangement with the with the Labor Party in the same way that in Britain the Conservatives have entered a formal arrangement with the Lib Dems, and they have a kind of alliance with agreed sets of principles and an agreed policy agenda. I mean, is that sort of thing even a possibility?
Oh, look, there's a number of things that could be possibilities, and I'm pretty clear about not wanting to go into that in public. We're going into these discussions in good faith, and I think that means respecting the principles of negotiations. But, I mean, in the same way that the Lib Dems are in a position now in the UK to start thinking about that. I mean, one of the things that I think has been lost in the last few days is that the biggest swing to any party at this election wasn't to the coalition, it was to the Greens. We had almost double the swing to us that the coalition had, 3.7 compared with 1.9. And something that puts me in a slightly different position, I think, to the independents is that we went in with, I guess, a policy mandate. We were the only party that wanted an immediate price on carbon, and people responded.
Yes, but obviously this is a numbers game, and when the independents look at stability over a long period of time, they're going to take into account that the Greens will have, in July of next year, control of the balance of power in the Senate, with a large block of senators that don't come into play until then. So the big question is, would you be prepared, would the Greens be prepared to establish a formal agreement with the Labor Party to look at a long period of time having stability in both houses with a formal agenda?
Look, again, I'm not going to go into what may or may not be being discussed, but
is that something you'd like? Is that something you'd like to see happen, though, and in the same way that it happened in Britain?
Well, look, my priority at the moment is that we're in a position where neither of the major parties has a majority, and I think the priority at the moment is to work towards a situation where we end up with stable and effective and progressive government. And my mandate as someone who is elected on values of compassion and sustainability and equality is to see those values and the policies that we stood for implemented.
OK, let's go to Nick Xenophon. Could you imagine a kind of Labor-Green alliance working of any kind that would provide stability across both houses of Parliament?
It would work better if the Greens had more seats in the lower house, because the reason why I think the Liberal Democrats Conservative alliance works in the UK is because quite clearly they have the numbers with their combined vote. But here it's a much more fluid situation. You've got three differing independents, Andrew Wilkie from Tasmania, and hopefully that'll be confirmed soon. It's a completely different situation. I think that Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor and Bob Katter have made it all clear that they're acting together in terms of the whole issue of process. They won't necessarily agree on all issues, and that was clear at the National Press Club today. So it is a different situation. So whilst the Greens can offer a deal in a sense in the Senate in terms of stability, if you like, in terms of some alliance, I don't think that will work unless there is, unless they have the numbers or the balance of power in their own right in the lower house, and that's what the difficulty is for them, I think.
Let me ask you this: can you see, Nick Xenophon, can you see a formula, some kind of formula? Sorry. That's all right. You can fix up your earpiece there, no problem. Can you see some kind of formula by which stability could be created in government over 3 years, particularly when you think about the Greens being in this, unique balance of power situation in July?
It would have to be in concert with the lower house independents, and I know that they've been talking, and I've been playing phone tag with Bob Brown tonight. Look, I think it is possible, but it's still too early to say. It really depends, I think, on the number of seats that the coalition ends up with. If they end up with 74 seats, I would have thought their chances of forming government, all things being equal, would be slightly stronger than if they only had 72 or 73 seats. I think it's pretty axiomatic. So, look, if there's a set of principles, it can be done. It was done back in 1991 with the Greiner government in New South Wales, and Tony Windsor was a part of that. So it is possible to have a set of principles and a set of protocols for good and stable government. So it's not out of the question, but I think we've got a way to go before we get to that stage.
Adam Bandt, how do you see this ending up?
Look, I'm optimistic that we can work through, certainly between myself and the Gillard government and the Labor Party and reach an arrangement. It's going to take some time, and we're working through it methodically and responsibly. And I'm also interested in continuing the discussions with the independents who I'll be sitting with on the crossbench, because I think if there's one thing that's clear from this election is that I don't think either of the major parties could say that they've won, and that to the extent that we can work out from it what people in Australia are asking for, it is to hear the voices of third parties and independents more. And I think there's some real opportunities for reform of the parliamentary process. For example, getting private members' bills debated and voted on, and having that guaranteed, I think would be a very important reform.
Yes, Nick Xenophon, let's talk about the reforms, because you've been calling for many reforms of the way Parliament operates, the way the system operates, the way politics operates. What did you advise the independents, because you spoke to them today? I mean, what do you think are the absolute essential things that have to happen?
Look, I don't think I need to advise the lower house independents about the reforms. I think they know what the reforms are and they've outlined them. I think it's clear that we need to look at campaign finance reform so that we can have some fundamental reforms about the way politics is done in this country in terms of fundraising and in terms of election funding. That's pretty fundamental. We need to have truth in advertising. That's something that the Greens, amongst others, have been calling for a long time. And we need to reform question time and also the way that both houses do their business, and having an opportunity for private members' bills, private senators' bills to actually be debated and voted upon, I think is very important. And Rob Oakeshott is right. You see the very best of politicians when they get a chance to vote on a conscience vote. It's a robust debate. It may be adversarial, but it's about issues and ideas rather than a clash of personalities, and that's a good thing in a democracy.
Nick Xenophon, on this campaign finance reform, can you imagine the Labor Party being prepared to give up this guaranteed finance it gets from the unions?
Well, if the quid pro quo is that you get better public funding, but it means that political parties can't then put their snouts in the private sector or the union trough, then I think that would be a good thing. And it means politicians would get to eat less rubber chicken dinners. That would be a good thing as well.
Adam Bandt.
Oh, look, I think that the Greens have been calling for some time for a system of publicly funded elections so that donations don't come from third parties to political parties. Third parties can run their own advertisements and so on if they like, but a publicly funded system of elections is something that I think there's an opportunity to move towards.
Adam Bandt, were you encouraged by what you saw from at least two of the three independents on the issue of climate change and action on climate change?
Yeah, I think that there was any objective analysis of today's press club lunch event, yields some pretty interesting facts. One is that 3 out of the 4 of us who are sitting up there, 3 independents and the Greens, 3 out of the 4 of us wanted a price on carbon immediately, reflecting, I think, community and business sentiment that, look, let's just get it in and get on with it. And 4 out of 4 people sitting on that panel wanted greater support for renewable energy technologies and could see the benefits of that being what drives Australia in the 21st century rather than coal export. And I think it's not my job to give advice to the major parties as to how they want to conduct themselves, but I think it's a pretty interesting observation.
Nick Xenophon, final comment from you, and I'm wondering if that interest in climate change or that strong passion for it on the part of some independents makes it more difficult for Tony Abbott to win them in the end.
Well, it's certainly more of a challenge. It's interesting that whilst Bob Katter has a different perspective on climate change, he does support renewable energy, he does support ethanol production, which is a cleaner fuel. That, I think that augurs well for those who want to reduce greenhouse gases and want to tackle, at the very least, the risk of climate change in terms of fundamental risk management. I think that's been Tony Windsor's view, so I think that's a good sign. It means that Tony Abbott would have to do a lot more in terms of direct action and I think ultimately look at some form of emissions trading scheme, one that would be much more effective and less cumbersome than the government scheme, which I thought was deeply flawed, as did the Greens. So I don't think Tony Abbott's out for the count yet. But I think after tonight he's got a few more challenges.
Okay. All right, that's where we'll have to leave you both, Senator Nick Xenophon and Adam Bandt. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you.